All right, so let's talk about Angular. Angular as a, we've already taken a look at React. Many of the concepts that Angular uses are somewhat similar to some of the concepts that we've been covering in React. Although Angular is so much more extensive, right? Some folks consider it that takes up or takes over, the entire development process in the front end. It's way too opinionated, and it forces you to do things in a very specific way. And so some folks find it somewhat constraining, and prefer React in that you're free to do all sorts of different things in React, which you're not in Angular. Whereas React is a library that it's a fairly small library that is specific for for rendering the client, for rendering dynamic content. Angular is that plus many other things that we had to build ourselves, and we had to make some decisions on the React side. Angular has a very specific solution that you have to follow that particular pattern. Angular provides what's called a model view controller design pattern. Right? So all their applications built on Angular must follow this design pattern, and it facilitates a lot of the things if you follow the pattern. If you try to get away from that pattern, Angular works against you. So it kind of boxes you into thinking in one particular way. Right? It uses the TypeScript programming language. Very much like React. It's a higher level language that gets transpiled into a lower level JavaScript implementation that is understood by most browsers. Right? But you program at a higher level language that is not yet supported widely by most browsers. Right? So usually, just like TypeScript gets compiled, just like React, JSX gets compiled down to JavaScript. Same thing, TypeScript is compiled down to JavaScript, so that regular browsers can understand it. It's open source. It's a framework that's developed and maintained by the Angular team at Google. It also, it makes use a lot of technologies that have been around for quite a while in the middle tier world that matured there over decades. Folks working on large enterprise applications, and so a lot of the ideas that grew up in that environment, Angular and many other libraries, similar frameworks, are borrowing some of those ideas and bring them over to the front side development. Okay, usually those ideas were created to deal with the complexity of building large applications, right? Of you wanting to be able to decouple large applications, right? And being able to do separation of concerns. So a lot of these design patterns that were developed in over decades in the middle tier and in the enterprise world, a lot of those ideas are now finding their way into front-end development. Okay, so things such as inversion of control, singleton patterns, services, factory, all these design patterns that have been around for forever, are now readily available also in the front end. Again, because front-end development has evolved quite a bit and has become very complex. Right? It used to be that it was just JavaScript validating just a simple form, right? But that has become much more complex today, right? Where folks are demanding applications that are running on the front end that have, are as complex as any desktop application, right? That need to be responsive, that need to be have immediate response to somebody's immediate feedback to user interaction. So a lot of the idea, strong typing, generics, things that have been around for a while in Java, C# and whatnot, are now available in the front end. So as I mentioned earlier, so Angular is a model view controller, or heavily is based on the model view controller design pattern, where again it's a type of separation of concern principle, right? Where things are so complex that we're trying to divvy up what are all the different concerns that we have when we're building applications, and three large concerns in large applications is that, well, how is it that we're going to structure the data, right? And capture the fact that for each one of these there's a whole bunch of those, that this one is related to that one. So all those relationships, right, fall under the bucket of the M, the model, right? And there's all sorts of concerns of how to deal with that. How do you store it? How do you retrieve it? How you query it? How do you update it? How you delete it? How you manage the relationships? There's a whole set of concerns on how to deal with that, right? Then there's the concern of making things look pretty, just rendering the data, right? That either you do pagination when it's too large, whether you do filtering, whether you render it as tables or as cards or how you navigate from one another. So all those are a set of concerns. Again, they're fairly complex, and they all fall under the bucket of views, right? And usually these concerns don't overlap, right? So for instance, the view doesn't really care how this data is structured, right? And the way you structure the data doesn't really care how you're going to render this, right? So there's no overlap on the concerns. And that's why we separate them, and there are a set of skills that are specific to each one of these buckets of concerns. And then there's a controller where you try to map the events that users generate as they interact with the view, right? They click, they drag, and you have to intercept all those events, that stream of events that manipulate the model, right? That add, that remove, that update, that find things, right? Because of user interaction, as users generate all these events, we manipulate the model, and so there's a map in between. So the controller does all this, the mapping between user events and modifying the model. And Angular provides very well-defined abstractions, to support this design pattern, right? And this and many other design patterns but the large, huge architectural pattern, right, is the model view controller. Okay. Learning Angular. A lot of folks consider Angular so much harder to learn, since it's a much bigger thing to learn. There's lots and lots of different concepts. Although the way I structure the course, I tackle React first because most people consider it to be a much easier, much shallower learning curve to start with React. And many of the concepts that we tackled in React are now readily transferable to Angular. So I hope that the way I structured it, looking at React first, and talking about things such as single page application and components, right, and state management and navigation. So all those concepts, we understand why things are the way they are in JavaScript front-end applications. So all those same concepts are applicable in Angular. So hopefully we don't have to cover that already. Perhaps it'll be only just a syntax change. Here's how you do navigation in React. Well, here's how you do it in Angular. So it'll just be a syntax difference. But the concept is the same. Right? So the only thing you'll need to learn is that the syntax is different. Right? So hopefully I have succeeded at making the steep learning curve of Angular a little shallower. Obviously, there's many other concepts that have no parallel in React. So those will be new. Right? So we'll have a chance to focus more on delving on these newer concepts. You know, the fact of having a controller, having a service, even though we already did services in React, right? And so, but React doesn't really care how you do a service. It's not its business. It's not React's concern of how you do a service, how you talk to the database, right? That's not the point of React. React just does rendering, right? But because we looked at services, how to do it in JavaScript, those are readily applicable in Angular. So a lot of the same concepts apply here as well. So yeah, so hopefully I've made Angular. I will have made Angular easier and faster to pick up. All right. Let's see. Just like in React, there's a command line interface that allows you to very quickly get started. In React, you have create React app, right, which create a boilerplate, ready to go, ready to run project, right? Similar in Angular, and it's called the Angular command line interface, and you can install it by using npm install. -g means global. And then @angular/CLI, right? That will install an executable on your command line, and the command line is called ng for Angular. And you can create a simple hello world just by typing ng. Ng is unlike create React app that only allows you to just create an application. Ng, it's actually, you can pass it tons of things, allows you to create all sorts of things. One of the things that it can create is a brand new Angular application. So you can say ng new hello world. And then you can go into the hello world CD and then just run the application. You can either use npm start, just like you do in React. Right? Or you can also use the ng command, ng serve. ng-serve will call npm start, but then it will also, if you do -- open, it will open up a window with the application already running. So here's what it opens up. Just like React, it takes a particular standard port where it hosts the application. React uses 3000, whereas Angular uses 4200. Okay, but just the same thing, and that's what it looks like, the default app. Okay, so components. So very much like React uses the concept of a component. The two concepts are slightly different. The interpretation of the idea of a component in React is slightly different in Angular. In React, usually you want to it promotes the creating small components that build on each other, and each one will have its own tag, right? And ideally you don't have components that are large, that you just have many smaller ones that build on each other. Yes, and the same thing is in React, but there's one big difference, is that on React, typically you mix and match both the logic and the content, right? Where you have you might break it up into a container, right? Where you have where you host event handlers and state management, and then you have lots of functional rendering, right, of the components. And you have very little logic, so you break it up that way, right? You have the components that have mostly content, right, and mostly logic to iterate over content and whatnot. But it's not responsible for maintaining its own state, right? You have a separate component that is usually we refer to them as a container component, right? Or even better, you have a Redux handling of all this state management. The way this same idea is implemented in Angular is that a component is really considered a collection of four artifacts or four files, basically four files. And one file is strictly HTML, right? HTML with an enhanced version of HTML, but there's no JavaScript in it, right? Unlike in React, you might have, in your functional components, right? You might have lots of HTML, and then you'll have like a map, right? Or you might have an on-click calling a function, or some small little JavaScript embedded. Right here, typically you do not, in the HTML, you don't have any JavaScript. Instead, you have special attributes. Like in HTML, you have attribute, name value pairs. Attribute, name value, name value, name value, right? And so some of those attributes, Angular defines its own attributes, right? And those are used to bind with some back logic, implemented in JavaScript that you never see, right? It's implemented by the core Angular, right? So, for instance, there might be an attribute that allows you to iterate over some collection, or some other attribute that allows you to bind to some field or some variable in the model. Okay, so HTML is strictly HTML, right? No JavaScript, but it's an enhanced HTML. It has some attributes that are Angular specific. Yes. And instead, the logic strictly the logic of handling event handlers and whatnot strictly lives in TypeScript, a TypeScript only file. Okay, so this would be the equivalent of splitting the container, right, and the functional component, right, where the container mostly has event handlers and state management, right, and it provides the state to all the child components, right. But here they're all part of the same component, right? So all the logic, all the event handlers live on the TypeScript file, right, and has variables that maintain the state and whatnot. And there's absolutely no HTML whatsoever. Whereas the HTML only has HTML and has bindings that bind to the TypeScript side. Okay, so in that sense, it's a very strict separation of these two worlds of the view, HTML being the view, and the TS, right, being the controller. The controller, as I mentioned earlier, the controller's responsibility is to handle events, right? Handle events and update the state. Right? So those two, the HTML and TS, have pretty much are similar to what you would expect, the container in React and the functional components in React. Yes. Right. The other two components are a test, so a specification, a JavaScript test specification that promotes testing, creating unit tests for that particular TypeScript component. Right. So a component usually is a self-contained element or component that can be tested on its own, and then some CSS that is specific to this one component. Okay, so together, right, they are considered to be one single thing as the component. Make sense? All right. So to create a component is very easy. You just from the using your IDE, you can say create me a brand new TypeScript file. So here's a brand new TypeScript file that we're going to call it hello-world.components.ts. That's a naming convention. The first part of that is the kind of the feature of what you're building, then followed by .components, then followed by TS TypeScript. TypeScript is it's a language that is it's a superset of JavaScript. So all JavaScript files are TypeScript. So if you just write plain JavaScript, it's already a TypeScript file. TypeScript adds all tons of other things, right, such as interfaces, inheritance, constructors, strong typing that you don't find in just plain old JavaScript. Right? So it adds all sorts of new features. It's a great language. A lot of things are going to be very, very similar, like imports and classes and exports and things like that. So a lot of the things that we've been using and writing for ES6 for React are readily applicable here in TypeScript. So here, there in the component, we're gonna just do an export class, a hello world component, and to make it a component, we can import the components tag or the component modifier, right? Decorator, sorry, the decorator. You can grab it and then you can decorate the class as a component, very much like you do in Java, right? You do and you decorate it as a controller or as a REST controller or as a whatever, right? And so this just adds features, right, or adds behaviors to that particular class, such as knowing that presumably there's some HTML that is associated to this TypeScript, right? That's what makes a component, right? That there's some HTML that goes along with this component that we can configure through that component. Notice that there's a parenthesis there in the component, and that parenthesis allows us to configure certain things about this one component. For instance, one of the things that we can do is configure what is the tag we want to use, right? So we very much like in React, right? The name of the class or the name of the function typically is the actual name of the tag, right? Here, the name of the class is one thing, but you can choose whatever tag you want, and you can configure that, right? You can configure it by providing notice it's a JSON object instead of the component, right? You can say my selector is hello-world. So now you can just say tag open pointy brackets hello-world, and now you're referencing this component, right? It'll render whatever the HTML is associated to this component. Right now there's no HTML associated to the component, and that's configurable through a template, right? A template. Here, the template, we're providing the template as an inline template. We're saying this is actually the HTML that is going to replace that tag. So if you say, hello world, it's going to be replaced by that content, h1 hello world. Make sense? Basically, the content of the template will be injected whenever you see hello world. Make sense? Right? Now, usually you wouldn't, if it's just a simple one-liner, right, or maybe even just a couple of lines, you could get away with just embedding it in here, right? But if it's something more complex that has, loops and it has some logic of displaying this or that, or some event handlers, typically you would not embed it inside of this file. Instead, you would point to a file that would contain the HTML. Okay, and that's the more common use, right? That you point to a separate file. If you have it here in the template embedded, you almost have React, right? Where you have the mixture of both the logic, state management, and the rendering, right? But just the syntax is different, right? The template would be the equivalent of the render function that returns some HTML. Yes? The more common use case is that it just points to a different file where you have the HTML. Okay. Now, to officially declare this to be a component, the component needs to be registered with the infrastructure, right? And the way you configure it is there's a dedicated file called the app.modules that was created for you when you did ng-new. It creates this configuration file where you can declare all sorts of things. You can declare components. You can declare, for instance, later on we'll see that we can declare also singletons, factories, services. We can declare all sorts of things. We're going to have to come back here and declare these so that they're available globally to the rest of the application. Right? Other things such as if there are certain features that are not turned on by default, right? So you can turn them on here. You can load certain modules that are not loaded by default, so you would turn them on here as well. So we'll come back to the app modules quite a bit. So here we imported our brand new component and we added it to the declarations. Hello world component. Notice that there was already a component in here. Right? This is the default component. This is the default entry point to the application, which is called the app component. Right? The default rendering. This default rendering. That's the default component. That's the default component that renders just some text and some images. Right? We can override that. We can just throw away the content. We can go into the app component, right? And say, okay, well, I'm just going to blow away the original content. I don't want that image. I don't want that text there. I'm just going to put my brand new Hello World tag that I just built. Okay. If I put it there and I re-render, I see my Hello World that it's in the template. Make sense? Very easy. Yes?